March 2nd, 221. And after today, there's only 3 days left. All late work is due, so be sure and suffer and get your work done and turned in. The more you do, the better off you feel, the less you have to worry about. So keep that in mind. I do have tutoring after school today from 4:40 to 5:30. I'll be here till at least 5. If nobody shows up, I'm not going to stay much later than that. So if you do need to come later, be sure and message me. I know a number of you have already messaged me that you're catching up. So awesome. Keep doing that. You're a good person. Today we're going to focus on what makes a character complex and believable. We already talked about dynamic character versus static character. We're just going to think about the characters we've read about so far as we read. And then, of course, this mindset, I will do the work now. Yes, of course, your camera's turned off. I could not see. I couldn't tell you to turn off your phone, pay attention to your reading or not. You have to do that for yourself. So I really want you to pay attention, to finish reading this story with us so you understand it. It's a good story. And the ending's pretty cool. So be sure you're with us so you can do the discussion. So I will analyze how a character's motivations and their actions create believable characters, and they create the theme, right? If you took the quiz, you know, right? We've talked about it last week and the week before. You know, the characters are what the story is all about. So what they do, what they learn, I mean, that's got to create the theme, doesn't it? And then our discussion question, our main discussion question, Through the Tunnel explores the thematic topic of childhood and maturity, coming of age. Well, how does part 2 explore this theme? And that's kind of a funny word to use, right? Explore. Really, if you just put in a word that you think it means or sounds like, you're going to be fine. Just remember to trust yourself. What do they mean by explore? Well, what word would you put in there if explore wasn't there? That's all we have to do. And then trust yourself, take a shot. And something like part 2 explores the theme by, and you're going to talk about what else? By Jerry and what he does and what happens to him, right? And for our close today, we'll think like a writer. How do authors create believable characters? And we're going to be talking about that as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and get to our work for today. If you go into Through the Tunnel by Doris Lessing, that thought question is there in the discussion if you think of something later to add to it. And but open up your own copy of Through the Tunnel, and it'll look like this, kind of like the first one, but it says part 2. Open up your own copy of Through the Tunnel and be reading on your own, because you're going to read the last part on your own. Remember, we're going to create that movie in our minds, right? I think most of us have gone to the coast. Maybe some of us have gone snorkeling or even gotten a tank and gone diving. Even if you haven't, we've all seen documentaries. We've all seen different shows where we see people swimming underwater, and most of us have experienced it. So we're going to call on that experience to help ourselves connect with this. And then think about it. How long can you hold your breath for? Most of us probably a minute, close to a minute. Maybe some of us can hold it longer, those that have practiced. So be thinking about that as we read as well. All right, anybody need a copy of the story? If it's not opening up for them, be sure and let me know. We'll get started in just a minute. All right, let's get started. Through the Tunnel by Doris Lessing. On vacation with his mother in a foreign country, a young boy makes a decision that could change his life or end it. And the quote, "He would do it if it killed him," he said defiantly to himself. And here's a little background in case you were not here yesterday. While on vacation to the beach in France with his mother and allowed to explore on his own, 11-year-old Jerry saw older boys, y'all's age, right, 16, 17-year-olds, diving off and coming up on the other side of a huge rock formation, and is shocked at how long it took them and that they could survive so long without air. When he can't do it too, they laugh at him and walk away, and he cries and is very upset with himself for not being able to do what they do. Jerry explores and realizes that there must be a cave that tunnels under the rock. He wants to explore, but the salt water hurts his eyes. And we talked about his motivation yesterday. Like, why is this kid pushing himself to do this, right? The kids that he would want to impress are already gone, but Who's he trying to impress now, right? Okay, let's get started. I want some swimming goggles, he panted, defiant and beseeching. She gave him a patient, inquisitive look as she said casually, well, of course, darling. But now. He must have them this minute and no other time. He nagged and pestered until she went with him to his shop. As soon as she had bought the goggles, he grabbed them from her hand as if she were going to claim them for herself, and was off, running down the steep path to the bay. Jerry swam out to the big barrier rock, adjusted the goggles, and dived. The impact of the water broke the rubber-enclosed vacuum, and the goggles came loose. He understood that he must swim down to the base of the rock from the surface of the water. He fixed the goggles tight and firm, filled his lungs, and floated face down on the water. Now he could see. All right, let's use our imaginations. We're underwater with Jerry. It was as if he had eyes of a different kind, fish eyes that showed everything clear and delicate and wavering in the bright water. Under him, 6 or 7 feet down, was a floor of perfectly clean, shining white sand, rippled firm and hard by the tides. 2 grayish shapes steered there, like long, rounded pieces of wood or slate. They were fish. He saw them nose toward each other, poised motionless, make a dart forward, swerve off, and come around again. It was like a water dance. A few inches above them, the water sparkled, as if sequins were dropping through it. Fish again. Myriads of minute fish, the length of his fingernail, were drifting through the water, and in a moment he could feel the innumerable tiny touches of them against his limbs. It was like swimming in flaked silver. The great rock the big boys had swum through rose sheer out of the white sand, black, tufted lightly with greenish weed. He could see no gap in it. He swam down to its base. Again and again he rose, took a big chestful of air, and went down. Again and again he groped over the surface of the rock, feeling it, almost hugging it in the desperate need to find the entrance. And then, once, while he was climbing to the black wall, his knees came up, and he shot his feet out forward, and they met no obstacle. He had found the hole. He gained the surface, clambered about the stones that littered the barrier rock until he found a big one, and with this in his arms, he let himself down over the side of the rock. He dropped with the weight straight to the sandy floor. Clinging tight to the anchor of stone, he lay on his side and looked in under the dark shelf that the place where his feet had gone. He could see the hole. It was an irregular dark gap, but he could not see deep into it. He let go of his anchor, clung with his hands to the edges of the hole, and tried to push himself in. He got his head in, found his shoulders jammed, moved them sidewise, and was inside as far as his waist. He could see nothing ahead. Something soft and clammy touched his mouth. He saw a dark frond moving against the grayish rock, and panic filled him. He thought of octopuses, of clinging weed. He pushed himself out backward and caught a glimpse as he retreated of a harmless tentacle of seaweed drifting in the mouth of the tunnel. But it was enough. He reached the sunlight, swam to shore, and lay on the diving rock. He looked down into the blue well of water. He knew he must find his way through that cave or hole or tunnel and out the other side. First, he thought, he must learn to control his breathing. He let himself down into the water with another big stone in his arms so that he could lie effortlessly on the bottom of the sea. He counted 1, 2, 3. He counted steadily. He could hear the movement of blood in his chest. 51, 52. His chest was hurting. He let go of the rock and went up into the air. He saw that the sun was low. He rushed to the villa and found his mother at her supper. She said only, "Did you enjoy yourself?" And he said yes. All night, the boy dreamed of the water-filled cave in the rock, and as soon as breakfast was over, he went to the bay. That night, his nose bled badly. Anybody who's ever had a nosebleed, you can imagine. For hours, he had been underwater, learning to hold his breath, and now he felt weak and dizzy. His mother said, "I shouldn't overdo things, darling, if I were you." That day and the next, Jerry exercised his lungs as if everything, the whole of his life, all that he would become, depended upon it. Again, his nose bled at night, and his mother insisted on his coming with her the next day. It was a torment to him to waste a day of his careful self-training, but he stayed with her on that other beach, which now seemed a place for small children, a place where his mother might lie safe in the sun. It was not his beach. He did not ask for permission on the following day to go to his beach. He went before his mother could consider the complicated rights and wrongs of the matter. A day's rest, he discovered, had improved his count by 10. The big boys had made the passage while he counted 160. He had been counting fast in his fright. Probably now, if he tried, he could get through that long tunnel, but he was not going to try yet. A curious, most unchildlike persistence, a controlled impatience made him wait. In the meantime, he lay underwater on the white sand, littered now by stones he had brought down from the upper air, and studied the entrance to the tunnel. He knew every jut and corner of it, as far as it was possible to see. It was as if he already felt its sharpness about his shoulders. He sat by the clock in the villa when his mother was not near and checked his time. He was incredulous and then proud to find that he could hold his breath without strain for 2 minutes. The words 2 minutes, authorized by the clock, brought close the adventure that was so necessary to him. In another 4 days, his mother said casually one morning, they must go home. On the day before they left, he would do it. He would do it if it killed him, he said defiantly to himself. But 2 days before they were to leave, a day of triumph, when he increased his count by 15, his nose bled so badly that he turned dizzy and had to lie limply over the big rock like a bit of seaweed, watching the thick red blood flow onto the rock and trickle slowly down to the sea. He was frightened. Supposing he turned dizzy in the tunnel? Supposing he died there, trapped? Supposing his head went around in the hot sun and he almost gave up. He thought he would return to the house and lie down, and next summer, perhaps, when he had another year's growth in him, then he would go through the hole. But even after he had made the decision, or thought he had, he found himself sitting up on the rock and looking down into the water, and he knew that now, this moment, when his nose had just stopped bleeding, when his head was still sore and throbbing, this was the moment when he would try. If he did not do it now, he never would. He was trembling with fear that he would not go, and he was trembling with horror at the long, long tunnel under the rock under the sea. Even in the open sunlight, the barrier rock seemed very wide and very heavy. Tons of rock pressed down on where he would go. If he died there, he would lie until one day, perhaps not before next year, those big boys would swim into it and find it blocked. He put on his goggles, fitted them tight, tested the vacuum. His hands were shaking. Then he chose the biggest stone he could carry and slipped over the edge of the rock until half of him was in the cool enclosing water and half in the hot sun. He looked up once at the empty sky, filled his lungs once, twice, and then sank fast to the bottom with the stone. He let it go and began to count. He took the edges of the hole in his hands and drew himself into it, wriggling his shoulders in sidewise as he remembered he must, kicking himself along with his feet. Soon he was clear inside. He was in a small rock-bound hole filled with yellowish-gray water. The water was pushing him up against the roof. The roof was sharp and pained his back. He pulled himself along with his hands, fast, fast, and used his legs as levers. His head knocked against something. A sharp pain dizzied him. 50, 51, 52. He was without light, and the water seemed to press upon him with the weight of rock. 71, 72. There was no strain on his lungs. He felt like an inflated balloon. His lungs were so light and easy, but his head was pulsing. He was being continually pressed against the sharp roof, which felt slimy as well as sharp. And he again thought of octopuses and wondered if the tunnel might be filled with weed that could tangle him. He gave himself a panicky, convulsive kick forward, ducked his head, and swam. His feet and hands moved freely as if in open water. The hole must have widened out. He thought he must be swimming fast, and he was frightened of banging his head if the tunnel narrowed. 100, 101. The water paled. Victory filled him. His lungs were beginning to hurt. A few more strokes and he would be out. He was counting wildly. He had said 115, and then, a long time later, 115 again. The water was a clear jewel green all around him. Then he saw, above his head, a crack running up through the rock. Sunlight was falling through it, showing the clean, dark rock of the tunnel, a single mussel shell, and darkness ahead. He was at the end of what he could do. He looked up at the crack as if it were filled with air and not water, as if he could put his mouth to it to draw in air. 115, he heard himself say inside his head, but he had said that long ago. He must go on, into the blackness ahead, or he would drown. All right, we're in the second paragraph on page 10. Go ahead and continue reading on your own, finish it up, think about the discussion question, right? And then we'll talk about it in a little bit.